Hi everyone, and welcome back out to Harvest Hills Ranch. You know, when I'm interacting with my patients, oftentimes the conversation comes up, especially with my male patients, about testosterone and whether or not they should be considering testosterone replacement therapy, especially if they're getting a bit older, maybe having some symptoms of testosterone deficiency. Some of the folks have even gone as far as going ahead and starting to utilize testosterone replacement therapy. And today I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of things that I bring up in conversation that I hear that aren't addressed, that if you're thinking about doing testosterone replacement therapy, or even if you just want to simply optimize your testosterone, that you should be thinking about as well. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I have a passion for all things nutrition, health, and wellness related. And today we're going to take a deeper look at testosterone and really have an idea of how to take some steps to optimize your testosterone. And a lot of this just simply has to do with having a different thought process in how you approach this conversation. I'll say quite frankly that much of this conversation is made far too simplistic, in that if you have a low testosterone level, simply take testosterone replacement therapy, whether that is an injection or other administration route, and simply raise those testosterone levels, track it periodically with a lab test, and you should be on the right track. Here's a few things that I would suggest to think about if you have been considering that, or if you've already gone down that trail. There's no reason that you can't add some or start to think about some of these things if you've already started testosterone replacement therapy. And let me say this as well out of the gate. This video is by no means meant to try to present a position against testosterone replacement therapy. There are clearly indications where it is warranted. There are certainly times where it can make a significant difference in the way an individual feels. However, I still think that when we look at applying a therapy like this, that doesn't mean we do so at the extent of overlooking other lifestyle factors, other choices that we have to make, and also overly simplifying the nature of the conversation around that compound. To that end, one of the things, I've got a list of things here that I'm going to go through with you on this, and you'll see at the top of the list here is what I call the Hormone Orchestra. And this is probably one of the biggest things that gets overlooked. And I say that because when we talk about testosterone, testosterone falls in this category of what are known as androgens. It is a hormone in a bigger grouping of hormones that have what we would consider anabolic or androgenic activity. Other hormones that you may have heard about that fall into this category are going to be things like DHEA, androstenedione, dihydrotestosterone. These all come into the equation, and they should all be factored in just as much so as testosterone. They have much of the roles, or much of what we attribute physiologically to testosterone is in truth really more about how all of those androgens are working to stimulate an androgen receptor to create that response. It's not solely about just what testosterone is doing. So therefore, we want to look at all of these hormones together. Now, also, you should take into consideration when we're talking about hormones in general that there are hormones certainly outside of this androgen category which can have an impact. I'm going to mention this a bit as I go forward with you here, but we also should be thinking about hormones like progesterone, cortisol, estradiol. Even if you're a guy, you should be thinking about estradiol. There is a physiological role for estrogens in the male individual, so we don't want to overlook these, but the idea here is that we want to keep balance. This is also insightful when you start to look deeper at these individual hormones, because this begins to also create a mindset whereby we start to see that if we can replace some of the precursors to testosterone, it doesn't mean that we completely alleviate the problem, but it may mean that we're also replacing or addressing hormones that also need support. Let me state that a little bit differently here, in that it is highly unlikely that if you have a deficiency in testosterone, that you don't also have a deficiency in DHEA, androstenedione, and likely other hormones as well. So by taking a replacement of testosterone and not also accounting for these other hormones, we in turn create just simply a different state of imbalance. It may not be a testosterone deficiency imbalance, but it is nonetheless still an imbalance. And the whole idea with hormones is to create this overall orchestra of these hormones that interplay with each other and are working together in accord. That's the first thing. The second thing is testing. Typically testing with this comes down to looking at and tracking the total testosterone level. We look at numbers somewhere between anywhere from the 5 to 6 to 700. A lot of times are where individuals are trying to shoot for on this. Clear deficiencies are stated as 300 and less. If you're headed down towards 300, there's a probability that you're probably starting to feel symptomatic around your testosterone, but maybe not for reasons that I'll state coming up here in a minute. The point being on this is that if we're only looking at total testosterone, we may be missing the mark on this. And the rationale here being is that based on some of the evidence that's out there, total testosterone, not a bad marker, maybe not the best marker to truly reflect what the physiological impact of testosterone and to give some insight into other estrogens to other androgens may not be the best avenue to do that. In fact, looking at free testosterone can provide more insight than solely looking at total testosterone. So that is an excellent starting point. If you've been looking at total, start to also look at the free testosterone as well. Now, I also want to make mention that we have to understand that these hormones are guided by activity in the brain in multiple ways. But quite simply, when we just look at things known as feedback loops, we need to understand what the ability of the pituitary, of the central region in the brain is to be able to ultimately stimulate the production of testosterone. So if we look at things like luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, these are going to be things, especially luteinizing hormone, that we're going to be able to glean information as to how that's promoting or how that's trying to stimulate testosterone production. That can be extremely insightful and may give us insight into not necessarily a testicular problem, but maybe this is a pituitary issue that we need to dig deeper into. And there's some things that we can do nutritionally to ultimately support that. There's some things lifestyle we can do to support that as well. Bottom line on this is that the testing needs to match the ideology of what we talk about with what I'm talking about as the hormone orchestra, which is that we want to look not solely at one indicator, meaning in this case just testosterone. We want to look at other hormones that can also affect testosterone, but when we are looking at these hormones, we want to look at that free fraction to have a better understanding. Now, the other thing that we need to consider in this conversation is the transport of these hormones. Now, there are a couple of means of transport of hormones. And so quite simply what I mean by this is when we look at the effect of a hormone, and let's just keep the conversation around testosterone here. When we look at the effect of testosterone, testosterone has to be produced in the testes, and then it has to travel to other tissues, and it has to bind into the nucleus, into the center of that cell, and it ultimately has to create a message that tells that cell what proteins to in turn transcribe. All of that being said, that if we can't get testosterone from point A to point B, we're going to have some difficulties. And many times, some of you may have had your testosterone level checked, and then along with that, they check the sex hormone binding globulin. But what I'm here to share with you on that is that while that is definitely an important marker to assess and to look at, that by no means should be the only marker that we're talking about and looking at. In fact, when we look at one of the more basic blood proteins, albumin is also an efficient carrier of testosterone, as well as many other things. But the reason that we should be placing emphasis on looking at that albumin and not solely putting all of our attention onto sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG as it's abbreviated many times, is that SHBG has an affinity for hanging on to these androgens and to the sex steroids. It has a greater affinity. It holds on tighter to that testosterone. And interestingly enough, on that SHBG, for each SHBG molecule, there's 2 sites that hold on to testosterone. The initial binding of the first testosterone molecule is actually held more tightly than the second one is. So there is a lower affinity with the binding of the second testosterone. I'm sharing this with you because that directly translates to albumin, and when we have albumin as the transport, albumin has a lower affinity for binding testosterone, which means that that testosterone can be offloaded more easily. When it comes to looking at standard labs, things like total protein, albumin, globulin, these are all markers that should be looked at as well to give us an insight into what that total protein is, how albumin is being produced and utilized, and also is it serving as a contributor to efficiently mobilize testosterone and other androgens around throughout the body. That's your overall androgen transport. There are many things that can push these up and down. It's a bit too complex for this conversation. It would make this video extremely long, so I don't want to delve off into that. But nonetheless, we have to factor in this transport outside of SHBG. SHBG is important. There's things that push it up and down, but we also have to look at albumin and some of the other proteins that influence this as well. Now, what about some of the secondary hormones? This can actually tie into what I was just referencing with the different transport proteins. And what I'm talking about here are things like cortisol as a hormone or thyroid hormone. If an individual has a abnormal thyroid state, that's going to shift the SHBG levels. If we have elevations in cortisol, interestingly enough, one of these other proteins that mobilizes the testosterone and androgens is called corticosteroid binding protein. So we have SHBG, we have albumin, we have corticosteroid binding protein, and corticosteroid binding or corticosteroid sounds somewhat similar to cortisol intentionally. And cortisol, many individuals think about cortisol as being a stress-related hormone, and in many ways it is. It's a bit of an oversimplification now that we understand more in depth how that works. Point being here is that when we have excess levels of cortisol, cortisol can abnormally influence the transport proteins, thereby we can have an adequate level of testosterone, but we may not be moving that testosterone or these other androgens throughout the system as efficiently as what the lab might suggest that we are. And so that has to be factored in. And to backtrack for a moment, if we're not considering that as part of this overall hormone orchestra and we're not looking at that when we start to talk about the testing, we're going to miss that fact altogether and potentially the opportunity to look at how we can address that. Let's continue on here and let's talk about receptors, because we've looked at production of a hormone. We've talked about we've looked at production of testosterone. We've talked about how to get testosterone from point A to point B. But once we get testosterone to its end destination, we have to have that hormone respond efficiently at a receptor site. Now, let me say this out of the gate. There is not a way, to my knowledge, to commercially test whether or not your receptor sites, your hormone receptor sites, are efficiently working. We don't have a specific lab marker that tells us, yes, those testosterone receptors, which we would call androgen receptors, are working efficiently, or thyroid receptors are working efficiently, or insulin receptors are working efficiently. We have to deduce that by indirectly extrapolating information. So for example, insulin is the easiest case. If insulin levels keep climbing up, we would say that there is a decrease in insulin receptor sensitivity. If we see that testosterone levels need to continue to go higher and higher and higher to try to create a stimulus, that over time tells us that those testosterone, those androgen receptors, are not working as efficiently as they otherwise should be. What can we do about that? Well, there's some key nutrients that have a role here. Things like zinc, B6, magnesium, vitamin D. There's literature evidence to substantiate that those nutrients are key players in the activity of these androgen receptors. What that means is that you can have that hormone, the testosterone, the androgen, you can have that androgen interface with the androgen receptor, but yet still not create an active communication and active messaging to ultimately tell the cell what its next step should be. So we have to factor in these nutrients. We have to ultimately look for indicators. Things like if we see white spots on our fingernails, which we would classify as leukonychia. If we see those white spots, those are indications of a zinc deficiency. If we have fasciculations in the muscle where it feels like it's twitching, especially if that ever happens around your eye, these are indications of a magnesium deficiency or a magnesium need. Those would be indications if they are coupled with indications of low testosterone, or you're trying to optimize your testosterone. These are also things that you need to think about, because you need to make sure that these androgen receptors, once they're willing to take that communication from the androgen, as testosterone being one of these androgens, that it creates an effective response. So that's an important fact here as well. What about food? There's numerous ways that we could talk about that food play a role here, but one of the things that I'll share with you, and that I've really gravitated towards and seen evidence of with myself, with patients, with just simply the fact of looking in the literature and trying to find mechanistically, why is this having such a role? One of the food categories that I'll put in here is red meat. Red meat, if you're looking to increase your testosterone, you need to have red meat as part of your diet. You need to be consuming beef probably being the easiest red meat to access. For example, and reason being on this is, and again, this is one mechanism, I'll pick carnitine. We see from the literature that there is the ability of carnitine to promote testosterone levels. And that's an easy thing that you can start to do. And I'm also going to, as I go through some of these next points with you, I feel like it's also important to recognize the mental aspect of your testosterone, whether it's a replacement process or whether we're looking at an optimization process. If you're coming to this conversation looking at an outside source as the way that you're going to improve your testosterone, if you're only looking at an exogenous source to increase your testosterone status, you're missing the boat on this, guys. You're going to fail, because many of the things that we've talked about here aren't being accounted for. You as an individual, as a male, and even females, have a role to play in optimizing your hormones, and there's things that you can do. One of the easiest of which is make the appropriate food choices that are going to support that. Red meats can again have a big role here, and even saturated fats, it's a bit theorized that they can have a role in helping out with testosterone production as well. Those 6, I have more for you here that I think are important not to overlook as well. And the next one that I want to share with you are neurotransmitters. And more specifically, if we talk in the context of dopamine, there's a couple of ways that this is linked, but you will find that many times that what individuals factor as I have low mood, depressive type symptoms, we attribute that sometimes to just a bit too linear of a connection to, oh, let's just get your testosterone up and you'll feel better. You'll dig yourself out of that midlife crisis. And it will help. I don't want to state that it won't, but it's a bigger conversation than that, and we should also be looking at dopamine. There is a direct interface between dopamine and between testosterone, and if we can optimize the interaction between those two, inherently you're going to see a better response out of both. Motivation improves, and the other symptoms that are linked to testosterone are going to likely improve as well. Now, we mentioned food as being something that you could directly take action on. Exercise is the other. When we think about what testosterone is, think about testosterone as an anabolic hormone. And anabolic, we hear the terminology sometimes around that wording as anabolic steroids. Don't necessarily think in that context. Anabolic and its opposing side, which is catabolism or catabolic, is generically thought about as catabolic is breaking things down, whereas anabolic is building back up. Inherently, if we're looking to have an anti-aging and optimize our overall ability to do things throughout the day, we want to be in a more overall anabolic state. And so if we think in terms of anabolic exercise, what does that look like? Well, what that looks like is resistance training. And it looks like resistance training, and here's the key word for this, it looks like challenging resistance training. So we are putting out a sustained effort that is forcing us to work hard, and if we can do that, then inherently we see that there's going to be an anabolic response from that. That's not all driven by testosterone. There's other anabolic hormones that come into this conversation as well. Point being is that it is something that you can do to actively promote that increase. There's 8 things here, guys, that I've thrown out to you that need to be a part of your thought process when it comes to having your evaluation of testosterone, whether you're having a conversation with your physician and you need to dig deeper on these topics with them. You need to ask for more labs, more information. More data is never a bad thing to make better decisions with. So ask for that and just change the thought process. Look at your nutritional level. Look at, do I have nutrient deficiencies that I need to dig into and try to optimize? And I'll also throw one other tidbit out here, which is to say that I mentioned when it comes to these receptors, one of the key nutrients here is vitamin D. If you have a vitamin D deficiency, there is an interaction, a co-deficiency type state that often occurs with vitamin D with pantothenic acid, which is B5. B5 is not a cool nutrient. It's not one that's often talked about, but B5 is ultimately, if you look at how these steroid hormones are produced, like testosterone, at the very top of that production cascade sits B5. So if you have a B5 deficiency, inherently your ability to make these steroid hormones endogenously within your own body is already limited just because of that nutrient deficiency. So it's something else to think about there. So I won't continue to belabor these points, but these are all things that you can follow up on. If you're looking for more information about how to optimize your health, go to drarlandhill.com. You can find out about what I do and how I support patients. And if you're looking for optimal sources of grass-fed and finished beef, like I was talking about with the food, then you can go to harvesthillsranch.com and you can find out all about what Leah and I do out here to raise food with uncompromising principles. Until next time, guys, good luck raising that testosterone. I'll talk to you soon.